For centuries before the upheavals associated with the Late Bronze Age collapse, the Eastern Mediterranean operated within a remarkably interconnected political landscape. By the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, a network of powerful states controlled the major trade routes and agricultural centers of the region. Among the most influential were the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the imperial government of New Kingdom Egypt along the Nile, the palatial kingdoms of Mycenaean Greece in the Aegean, and the merchant city-state of Kingdom of Ugarit along the Syrian coast. These states formed a diplomatic system that extended across thousands of kilometers, linking the eastern Mediterranean with Mesopotamia and the wider Near East. Surviving records indicate that rulers maintained regular contact through diplomatic envoys, marriage alliances, and formal treaties. Royal courts communicated with one another through cuneiform tablets written in Akkadian, which functioned as the diplomatic language of the time. Many of these tablets were discovered in the archives of Amarna letters in Egypt, providing a detailed record of international relations during the Late Bronze Age. The Amarna correspondence reveals that kings frequently addressed one another as equals, referring to themselves as brother in formal diplomatic language. These messages discuss requests for military assistance, negotiations over trade goods, and the arrangement of royal marriages designed to strengthen alliances. Records indicate that diplomatic exchanges were often accompanied by elaborate gift-giving, including precious metals, luxury textiles, and finely crafted vessels. Such exchanges reinforced political relationships between royal courts while simultaneously facilitating long-distance trade. Maritime commerce played a central role in sustaining this international system. Merchant ships regularly crossed the eastern Mediterranean carrying valuable cargo between major ports. Archaeologists uncovered direct evidence of this trade in the remains of the Uluburun shipwreck, which dates to the late 14th century BCE. The cargo recovered from this vessel included large copper ingots, tin, glass ingots, ivory, ebony, and luxury goods originating from multiple regions. Analysis of the materials suggests that the ship had traveled through several trading hubs before its final voyage. Copper and tin were particularly important commodities within this system. These two metals were essential components in the production of bronze, the alloy that defined the military and economic technologies of the era. Cyprus served as a major supplier of copper, while tin was obtained through long-distance trade routes extending into Central Asia and Anatolia. Merchant fleets transported these resources to major manufacturing centers where bronze tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects were produced. The reliability of these supply chains was therefore critical to the stability of Bronze Age economies. Coastal cities functioned as vital nodes within these maritime networks. Ports such as Ugarit and Byblos served as intermediaries connecting inland kingdoms with seaborne trade routes. Archaeologists uncovered warehouses, administrative tablets, and harbor installations at these sites, indicating highly organized systems for managing commercial activity. Administrative records discovered in Ugarit describe merchants, cargo inventories, and diplomatic agreements regulating trade across the region. Political authority was essential for maintaining this complex system of exchange. Major empires established military garrisons and provincial administrations in strategic locations to protect trade routes and ensure the movement of goods. Egyptian inscriptions record military campaigns into the Levant intended to secure coastal territories and prevent rival powers from controlling vital ports. Similarly, Hittite kings conducted diplomatic negotiations and military operations designed to maintain influence over key trade corridors in Anatolia and northern Syria. Geography played a decisive role in shaping these interactions. The Mediterranean Sea provided a relatively efficient route for transporting heavy goods compared with overland travel. Seasonal winds and predictable coastal routes allowed ships to travel between ports with increasing regularity. At the same time, mountain ranges and deserts limited land-based communication, making maritime trade even more important for connecting distant regions. As a result, coastal cities became central hubs within the international economy of the Late Bronze Age. The interconnected nature of this system meant that disruptions in one region could have consequences far beyond local borders. Diplomatic records show that rulers frequently expressed concern over instability affecting neighboring states. Grain shortages, regional conflicts, and interruptions in trade could quickly spread across the network of alliances and economic dependencies, linking the great powers of the Eastern Mediterranean. By the 13th century BCE, this diplomatic and economic system represented one of the most sophisticated international orders of the ancient world. Powerful kingdoms maintained alliances through formal treaties, merchant fleets transported goods across vast distances, and coastal cities served as gateways between land-based empires and maritime trade routes. Yet, despite its apparent stability, the system relied on delicate balances of power and resource distribution. Records from the later decades of the Late Bronze Age increasingly suggest that these balances were beginning to weaken. In the generations that followed, disruptions to trade networks, political rivalries, and population movements would challenge the stability of this interconnected world. Evidence from archaeological excavations and surviving texts indicates that the pressures affecting this system were already beginning to accumulate during the closing centuries of the Bronze Age. Before we continue deeper into the history, consider subscribing to the channel and enabling notifications so you don't miss future Nightfall history documentaries. If you find this topic interesting, you can also share your thoughts in the comments and mention which part of the story you find most fascinating. Across the Eastern Mediterranean during the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, maritime trade functioned as one of the primary mechanisms connecting distant kingdoms. Merchant vessels moved regularly between coastal ports, transporting metals, agricultural goods, and luxury items across thousands of kilometers of open sea. These commercial routes linked the Aegean, Anatolia, Cyprus, the Levant, and the Nile Valley, creating an economic system that depended heavily on stable navigation and secure harbors. Archaeological discoveries and textual records demonstrate that seaborne commerce had reached a level of organization and scale rarely seen in earlier periods of ancient history. One of the most significant pieces of evidence for this trade network comes from the remains of the Ulubran shipwreck, excavated during underwater archaeological expeditions in the late 20th century. The wreck dates to approximately the late 14th century BCE. The vessel carried an extraordinary cargo representing goods from multiple regions of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Among the materials recovered were more than 300 copper ingots shaped in the distinctive oxide form associated with Cypriot copper production. Alongside these were smaller quantities of tin, the second critical component required to produce bronze. Metallurgical analysis of the cargo indicates that the copper most likely originated from the island of Cyprus, known in ancient sources as Alatia. Written correspondence from the Late Bronze Age confirms that Cyprus served as one of the primary suppliers of copper to surrounding kingdoms. Tin, however, was far more difficult to obtain. Archaeologists and historians believe that tin may have been transported through long-distance trade routes stretching across Anatolia and possibly as far as Central Asia. The presence of both metals on a single merchant vessel illustrates how maritime trade functioned as the final link in a broader interregional supply chain. In addition to metals, the Ulubran ship carried a wide variety of luxury goods and raw materials. Excavators recovered glass ingots, carved ivory objects, ebony wood, ostrich eggshells, and finely crafted jewelry. Many of these items originated in regions far beyond the Eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian scarabs discovered among the cargo demonstrate connections with the royal workshops of the Nile Valley, while other materials appear to have come from the Levant or Mesopotamia. The diversity of these goods suggests that merchants operated within an extensive commercial network that integrated multiple civilizations. The distribution of such cargo required reliable port cities where goods could be exchanged, stored, and redistributed. Coastal settlements therefore played a crucial role in the economic infrastructure of the Late Bronze Age. Among the most important of these were cities such as Byblos and Ugarit. Archaeological excavations at these sites have revealed administrative archives, warehouses, and harbor installations that indicate highly organized commercial activity. Written records discovered at Ugarit include lists of imported goods, merchant transactions, and diplomatic agreements regulating trade between kingdoms. These coastal hubs were not independent economies but rather components of a broader international trading system. Goods arriving by sea were frequently transported inland along caravan routes that connected coastal ports with agricultural regions and imperial capitals. For example, shipments of copper and luxury goods arriving at Levantine ports could be transported inland to the territories of the Hittite Empire or further south toward the administrative centers of New Kingdom Egypt. This integration of maritime and overland trade routes created a highly interconnected economic landscape across the eastern Mediterranean. The efficiency of these trade networks depended heavily on political stability and cooperation between major powers. Diplomatic correspondence preserved in archives, such as the Amarna letters, indicates that rulers frequently negotiated agreements to protect merchant activity and maintain access to valuable resources. Trade disruptions could therefore have immediate consequences for multiple states simultaneously. A shortage of copper or tin would directly affect bronze production, which in turn influenced military capabilities and agricultural tool manufacturing. Geographical conditions also shaped the development of maritime commerce. The Mediterranean Sea offered relatively predictable seasonal wind patterns that facilitated navigation between ports. Ships commonly traveled along coastlines, stopping at multiple harbors to exchange goods and replenish supplies. This pattern of movement created a chain of interconnected ports stretching from the Aegean Islands to the Levantine coast. As trade intensified, many of these coastal settlements expanded in both population and economic importance. The growth of maritime commerce during the Late Bronze Age also encouraged the development of specialized professions. Merchant sailors, shipbuilders, harbor administrators, and caravan traders all participated in maintaining the flow of goods across the Mediterranean. Administrative tablets from trading centers show evidence of taxation, cargo inspection, and organized storage facilities, suggesting that commercial activity operated under regulated systems of oversight. By the 13th century BCE, maritime trade had become one of the central pillars supporting the political and economic stability of the eastern Mediterranean. Copper and tin traveled across vast distances, luxury goods circulated between royal courts, and coastal cities prospered as centers of exchange. Yet, the very complexity that made this system prosperous also made it vulnerable. Because multiple kingdoms depended on the same trade routes and resources, disruptions in maritime security or coastal stability could quickly ripple through the entire network. As trade expanded and ports grew in importance, coastal populations increased and new settlements emerged along strategic maritime corridors. These developments created prosperous communities closely tied to international commerce. However, the concentration of wealth and infrastructure along the coasts also meant that these regions would become particularly exposed to any future disturbances affecting Mediterranean navigation and security. In the closing decades of the 13th century BCE, Egyptian inscriptions began to record the appearance of unfamiliar maritime groups moving through the eastern Mediterranean. These accounts, preserved on temple walls and monumental reliefs, provide the earliest detailed descriptions of the peoples later known collectively as the Sea Peoples. The evidence comes primarily from the reigns of two pharaohs of the New Kingdom Egypt, Merneptah and Ramesses III. Their inscriptions describe encounters with coalitions of seaborne groups who approached Egypt's territories from both land and sea. One of the earliest references appears in the inscriptions commemorating a campaign of Merneptah around 1208 BCE. These texts record a military conflict in the western Nile Delta against a coalition that included Libyan forces and allied maritime groups. Among the groups listed were the Shurden and the Shikalesh, names that appear repeatedly in Egyptian records of the period. The inscriptions describe these groups as foreign warriors who arrived with their families and equipment, suggesting movements of entire communities rather than temporary raiding parties. Archaeologists and historians rely heavily on these inscriptions because they represent contemporary records created by Egyptian officials documenting military campaigns. The most detailed descriptions of the Sea Peoples come from monumental reliefs commissioned during the reign of Ramesses III in the early 12th century BCE. These reliefs are preserved at the temple complex of Medinet Habu on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes. Carved scenes on the temple walls depict both land battles and naval engagements between Egyptian forces and invading groups identified by name in accompanying hieroglyphic inscriptions. These visual and textual records remain the primary source for understanding how Egyptian officials perceived the Sea Peoples. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu list several distinct groups among the invading coalition. These include the Shurden, the Peleset, the Checker, and the Denyen. Egyptian scribes described these peoples as part of a broader alliance moving through the eastern Mediterranean during a period of widespread instability. The inscriptions state that these groups had already destroyed several cities before reaching the frontiers of Egypt, indicating that their movements affected large areas of the Near East. Reliefs depicting these groups provide important visual evidence about their equipment and organization. The carvings show warriors wearing distinctive helmets, some with curved horns and others with feathered crests. They carry round shields and long swords while fighting from both ships and chariots. These images differ noticeably from the equipment typically associated with Egyptian soldiers. The distinctive armor and weaponry depicted in the reliefs suggest that the invading groups came from regions with different military traditions than those of Egypt or the Levant. Another notable feature of the Medinet Habu reliefs is the depiction of ox-drawn carts accompanying the invading groups. These carts are shown carrying women, children, and household possessions. Egyptian inscriptions describe these movements as involving entire communities rather than only military forces. The presence of families in these scenes has led historians to interpret some of these movements as migrations rather than purely military expeditions. In this interpretation, the Sea Peoples were not only warriors but also populations seeking new territories during a period of broader regional disruption. Egyptian records also describe a major naval battle fought in the Nile Delta during the reign of Ramesses III around 1177 BCE. The reliefs depict Egyptian ships confronting fleets of foreign vessels attempting to enter the river mouths leading into the delta. Archers positioned along the Egyptian ships and along the riverbanks are shown firing arrows toward the approaching vessels. The inscriptions accompanying the scene describe how Egyptian forces blocked the maritime advance and defeated the coalition. These records portray the event as a decisive defense of Egypt's northern frontier against an alliance of migrating and raiding groups. The reliability of these records has been studied extensively by historians and archaeologists. Egyptian royal inscriptions were designed to celebrate the victories of the reigning pharaoh, and therefore they often emphasize the success of Egyptian forces while minimizing setbacks. Nevertheless, the detailed visual depictions and consistent naming of several groups across multiple inscriptions suggest that the accounts reflect real historical encounters. Archaeological discoveries from other regions of the eastern Mediterranean have also revealed destruction layers dating to roughly the same period described in the Egyptian texts. Another important aspect of the Egyptian inscriptions is the terminology used to describe these groups. Egyptian scribes frequently referred to them collectively as peoples from the islands in the sea. This phrase suggests that some of the groups may have originated from maritime regions of the Mediterranean rather than from inland territories. However, the inscriptions do not provide precise geographic locations for their homelands. Instead, they emphasize the destructive impact of their movements across coastal regions before reaching Egyptian territory. These records provide the most detailed contemporary descriptions of the Sea Peoples and remain central to modern attempts to reconstruct their history. Through inscriptions, reliefs, and military accounts, Egyptian officials documented encounters with multiple groups whose movements coincided with a period of widespread disruption across the eastern Mediterranean. Yet despite the level of detail preserved in these monuments, the inscriptions offer only limited information about the origins of these groups. The identities of the Shurden, Peleset, Jeker, Denyen, and other groups remain subjects of ongoing historical investigation. Archaeologists continue to compare Egyptian records with material evidence discovered across Anatolia, the Levant, and the Aegean in order to determine where these populations may have come from and how their migrations developed. The Egyptian inscriptions therefore provide the first clear historical record of the Sea Peoples, documenting both their presence and their military encounters with Egypt. However, while these records describe the events that occurred along the Nile frontier, they do not explain the deeper causes or geographic origins of the groups involved. The search for those origins requires examining archaeological evidence and historical developments beyond Egypt's borders. Despite the detailed descriptions preserved in Egyptian inscriptions, the geographic origins of the groups collectively known as the Sea Peoples remain uncertain. The surviving records identify several distinct groups, but they do not provide clear information about their original homelands. As a result, historians and archaeologists have developed multiple theories based on linguistic analysis, archaeological discoveries, and comparisons of material culture across the Mediterranean. These interpretations attempt to explain how diverse maritime groups appeared across the eastern Mediterranean during the closing decades of the Late Bronze Age. One of the most widely discussed theories connects some of the Sea Peoples with regions of the Aegean. Archaeological evidence from coastal settlements in the southern Levant has revealed pottery styles closely resembling those produced in the Aegean world during the Late Bronze Age. Excavations at sites associated with the later Philistine settlements uncovered ceramic forms and decorative techniques that closely parallel those found in the palatial centers of Mycenaean Greece. These ceramics include distinctive shapes and painted motifs that were characteristic of Mycenaean craftsmanship during the 13th century BCE. Scholars have therefore proposed that the group known in Egyptian records as the Peleset may have originated within the broader Aegean cultural sphere. Archaeologists uncovered early forms of locally produced pottery in Philistine territories that imitate Mycenaean designs, suggesting that migrants may have carried these traditions with them as they settled in the Levant. Over time, these imported styles evolved into regional variations that blended local materials with Aegean artistic influences. This pattern of cultural adaptation is often cited as evidence of population movement rather than simple trade. Another possible homeland for some Sea Peoples groups lies in western Anatolia. During the 13th century BCE, the western frontier of the Hittite Empire experienced repeated political disturbances. Hittite texts refer to conflicts with coastal populations and rival kingdoms along the Aegean-facing regions of Anatolia. These records describe unrest among groups living near maritime zones where contact with the Aegean world was frequent. Some historians suggest that instability within these areas may have contributed to population movements toward the south and east. The collapse of Hittite authority during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE may also have played a role in these migrations. Archaeological excavations at the Hittite capital of Hattusa revealed destruction layers dating to the final phases of the Late Bronze Age. Evidence from surrounding regions indicates that the political structure of the Hittite state fragmented rapidly during this period. As centralized authority weakened, populations living along Anatolia's western and southern coasts may have begun moving toward new territories along the eastern Mediterranean. In addition to Aegean and Anatolian theories, some researchers have proposed that certain Sea Peoples groups originated in the central Mediterranean. Linguistic comparisons between the names recorded in Egyptian inscriptions and later historical groups have suggested possible connections with populations from regions such as Sardinia or Sicily. The group identified in Egyptian sources as the Shur-Den has sometimes been associated with Sardinian populations due to similarities between the name Shur-Den and the later name of the island. However, these linguistic comparisons remain debated, and direct archaeological evidence linking these regions to the Sea Peoples is limited. Archaeological discoveries across the eastern Mediterranean indicate that multiple cultural influences were present during this period. Pottery styles, weapon types, and settlement patterns show evidence of interaction between Aegean, Anatolian, and Levantine traditions. These findings suggest that the Sea Peoples may not have originated from a single homeland. Instead, they may have represented a coalition of groups from different regions who moved through the Mediterranean during a period of widespread political and economic instability. Material evidence from settlement sites in the southern Levant provides some of the clearest indications of population movement. Excavations at cities later associated with Philistine culture have revealed new architectural forms, pottery styles, and dietary patterns appearing in the early 12th century BCE. Some of these features resemble practices known from Aegean contexts, including distinctive cooking vessels and storage containers. Archaeologists uncovered animal remains showing increased consumption of pork, a dietary pattern that differs from earlier Canaanite traditions in the same region. These changes in material culture have been interpreted as signs of new populations arriving in the Levant during the period following the conflicts described in Egyptian records. However, the process of cultural transformation appears to have occurred gradually. Imported pottery styles were soon replaced by locally produced variations, and architectural forms began to reflect adaptations to Levantine environments. This evidence suggests that incoming groups interacted with existing populations rather than completely replacing them. Historical research therefore presents the Sea Peoples as part of a complex pattern of migration and cultural interaction rather than a single invading force from a specific location. Multiple regions, including the Aegean, Anatolia, and possibly parts of the central Mediterranean, may have contributed groups who participated in the movements recorded in Egyptian inscriptions. These migrations occurred during a period when political systems across the eastern Mediterranean were experiencing increasing instability. Although the precise origins of each group remain debated, archaeological evidence shows that many of these populations eventually established settlements along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Material remains from these sites demonstrate the emergence of new cultural communities that combined influences from both local and incoming traditions. These developments marked the beginning of a new phase in the history of the Levant following the disruptions of the Late Bronze Age. As archaeological research continues, scholars continue to refine their understanding of how these groups moved across the Mediterranean and how their cultures developed after arriving in new territories. While the exact homelands of the Sea Peoples remain uncertain, the evidence increasingly suggests that their movements were part of broader migrations occurring across multiple regions of the Mediterranean world. In the decades that followed the conflicts recorded in Egyptian inscriptions, several of these groups began establishing permanent settlements along the eastern Mediterranean coastline, transforming the cultural and political landscape of the region. By the early 12th century BCE, one of the most powerful states of the Late Bronze Age had disappeared from the political map of Anatolia. For more than 4 centuries, the Hittite Empire had dominated central Anatolia and extended its authority across northern Syria. Its rulers negotiated treaties with Egypt, controlled major trade corridors, and maintained one of the most sophisticated administrative systems of the ancient Near East. Yet, within a relatively short period at the end of the 13th century BCE, this imperial structure fragmented and ultimately collapsed. The center of Hittite political power was the fortified capital of Hattusa. Located near modern Boğazkale in Turkey, Hattusa served as the administrative and ceremonial heart of the empire. Excavations conducted at the site have uncovered extensive archives of cuneiform tablets, monumental gateways, and large temple complexes that demonstrate the city's importance during the height of Hittite authority. These records reveal a highly organized bureaucracy responsible for managing taxation, diplomatic relations, and military operations across a vast territory. Archaeological evidence indicates that the city was abruptly abandoned and later destroyed around the beginning of the 12th century BCE. Layers of burned buildings and collapsed structures were discovered throughout the administrative districts of the city. Excavators also noted that many official archives were left behind rather than removed in an orderly evacuation. This pattern suggests a rapid breakdown of central authority rather than a gradual decline of urban activity. By the time later Iron Age communities appeared in the region, the imperial capital had already been deserted for decades. The weakening of the Hittite state can be traced to developments during the final decades of the 13th century BCE. Textual sources from this period describe increasing political instability within the royal court. Several succession disputes disrupted the continuity of leadership, and rival factions appear to have competed for control of the throne. Royal correspondence and administrative records indicate that these internal tensions strained the institutions responsible for governing the empire's provinces. In addition to internal political conflicts, the Hittite administration faced growing challenges along its frontiers. Western Anatolia had long been a region of intermittent conflict between Hittite authorities and independent coastal populations. Hittite diplomatic and military texts describe campaigns aimed at maintaining control over these territories and preventing rival powers from gaining influence along the Aegean coast. These frontier regions were strategically important because they controlled access to maritime trade routes linking Anatolia with the wider Mediterranean world. Economic pressures also contributed to the weakening of imperial stability. The Late Bronze Age economy depended heavily on long-distance exchange networks that transported metals, agricultural goods, and luxury materials between distant regions. Disruptions affecting these trade routes could therefore have significant consequences for states that relied on imported resources. Evidence from contemporary correspondence indicates that shortages of essential goods, including grain, were becoming increasingly severe during the final decades of Hittite rule. Several letters preserved in Hittite archives refer to food shortages and requests for emergency shipments of grain. In some cases, rulers of neighboring states were asked to supply food to regions experiencing famine conditions. These records suggest that environmental stress or disruptions to agricultural production may have affected parts of Anatolia during this period. When combined with political instability and military pressures, such shortages could significantly weaken the capacity of central authorities to maintain control. Military challenges also intensified during the late 13th century BCE. Hittite records refer to conflicts with groups moving along the western and southern coasts of Anatolia. Some historians interpret these references as possible early encounters with populations that later appeared in Egyptian inscriptions describing the Sea Peoples. However, the Hittite texts themselves rarely provide detailed descriptions of these groups, making it difficult to determine the precise nature of the conflicts. What is clear from the surviving records is that the Hittite administration was struggling to maintain authority across its territories. Provincial governors were responsible for collecting tribute, maintaining local garrisons, and ensuring the flow of goods along trade routes. As central authority weakened, these regional officials may have become increasingly independent, further eroding the cohesion of the imperial system. Archaeological evidence from northern Syria also reflects the broader disintegration of Hittite influence. Cities that had previously functioned as administrative centers under Hittite supervision show signs of destruction or abandonment during the same period as the collapse of the capital. Some settlements display burned layers and damaged fortifications, while others appear to have been gradually deserted. These patterns suggest that the political structures linking these regions to the Hittite state were no longer functioning effectively. The disappearance of the Hittite imperial government had immediate consequences for the broader political landscape of Anatolia and northern Syria. For centuries, the empire had served as a stabilizing power controlling key trade routes and mediating conflicts among neighboring states. Once that authority vanished, no single power was capable of replacing its administrative and military presence across the region. As a result, many territories that had once formed part of the Hittite imperial network became politically fragmented. Smaller regional kingdoms and local rulers emerged in the centuries that followed, but these successor states lacked the centralized coordination that had characterized the earlier empire. The sudden collapse of the imperial system therefore created a power vacuum that reshaped the political geography of Anatolia. At the same time, coastal regions that had previously been protected by imperial defenses became increasingly vulnerable to external pressures. Without the coordinated military structures of the Hittite state, frontier territories were less capable of resisting migrations, raids, or new settlement movements occurring across the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence from several coastal cities suggests that this period was marked by increasing instability and disruption. The fall of the Hittite Empire thus represented one of the most significant political transformations of the Late Bronze Age. A state that had once controlled vast territories and maintained diplomatic relations with other great powers had vanished within the span of a few generations. The collapse of its administrative institutions and military defenses altered the balance of power across the eastern Mediterranean. With Hittite authority gone, regions that had once been integrated into its imperial system were left exposed to new pressures emerging along the Mediterranean coasts and inland trade corridors. In the decades that followed, these vulnerable territories would become increasingly affected by wider movements of populations and maritime groups moving through the eastern Mediterranean world. One of the final surviving messages from the late Bronze Age city of Ugarit records a moment of growing alarm. Written on a clay tablet and preserved within the city's archives, the letter warns that hostile ships had appeared along the nearby coastline. The message, addressed to the ruling authorities, reports that enemy forces had already attacked surrounding territories and that the city's defenses were unprepared for the threat. Archaeologists discovered this tablet among a collection of administrative and diplomatic records that remained buried beneath the ruins of the city for more than 3 millennia. During the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, Ugarit had functioned as one of the most important commercial centers in the eastern Mediterranean. Located along the Syrian coast, the city occupied a strategic position connecting maritime trade routes with inland caravan networks extending toward Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Merchant ships regularly arrived at its harbor carrying copper from Cyprus, luxury goods from Egypt, and manufactured products from the Aegean world. Excavations at the site have revealed extensive warehouse districts, administrative buildings, and archives containing thousands of clay tablets documenting the city's economic and diplomatic activities. Many of these tablets were written in cuneiform script and preserved records of commercial transactions, diplomatic correspondence, and legal agreements. The archives demonstrate that Ugarit maintained close political and economic relations with neighboring powers, including the Hittite Empire and the government of New Kingdom Egypt. These relationships allowed the city to function as an intermediary trading hub within the wider Mediterranean economy. Goods arriving by sea were redistributed inland, while agricultural products and manufactured items from surrounding regions were exported to distant markets. Archaeologists uncovered several archives within the city's royal palace and administrative quarters. Among these documents are letters exchanged between Ugaritic officials and foreign rulers discussing trade arrangements, diplomatic alliances, and regional security. The presence of correspondence from multiple kingdoms illustrates how closely integrated Ugarit was within the broader political network of the Late Bronze Age. At the same time, the records also reveal that the city depended heavily on stable maritime routes for its economic prosperity. The final layers of the city's archives provide an unusually detailed glimpse into the circumstances surrounding its destruction. Several tablets discovered in the ruins contain urgent messages describing attacks along the coastline. One letter sent by a regional official warns that enemy ships had appeared suddenly and were conducting raids against nearby settlements. Another message reports that the city's military forces were deployed elsewhere, leaving the region vulnerable to attack. These documents indicate that the authorities in Ugarit were aware of an approaching threat, but lacked the resources necessary to respond effectively. Archaeological evidence confirms that the destruction of Ugarit occurred rapidly and with considerable violence. Excavations throughout the site have revealed thick layers of ash and collapsed building materials dating to approximately 1190 BCE. Many structures appear to have been burned during a single catastrophic event. Within the ruins of houses and administrative buildings, archaeologists found personal belongings, storage jars, and unfinished tablets that had been left behind when the city was destroyed. The presence of these items suggests that residents did not have time to organize an orderly evacuation. The destruction layer also indicates that the city was never rebuilt on its original site. Unlike some settlements that recovered after periods of conflict, Ugarit remained abandoned following its destruction at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Over time, wind-blown sediment gradually covered the ruins, preserving the final archives and material remains beneath layers of soil. The sudden end of the city represents one of the most dramatic examples of urban collapse during this period. The loss of Ugarit had broader implications for the economic structure of the Eastern Mediterranean. As a major port and administrative center, the city had served as a critical node linking maritime commerce with inland trade routes. Merchant vessels arriving from Cyprus or the Aegean relied on its harbor facilities to exchange cargo and distribute goods across the Levant. When the city was destroyed, these established commercial networks were severely disrupted. Archaeological surveys along the Levantine coast reveal that the destruction of Ugarit was not an isolated event. Several other coastal settlements display similar burn layers and signs of violent destruction dating to roughly the same period. Evidence from sites in northern Syria and the southern Levant suggests that multiple urban centers experienced sudden disruption during the closing decades of the 13th century BCE. In many cases, these cities were either abandoned or significantly reduced in size following the destruction. The causes of these events remain the subject of ongoing historical investigation. Some scholars suggest that maritime groups moving through the Mediterranean may have participated in attacks against vulnerable coastal cities. Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III describe encounters with coalitions of seaborne peoples who were moving along the eastern Mediterranean coast during roughly the same period. While these inscriptions do not specifically mention Ugarit, the chronology corresponds closely with the archaeological evidence from the city's destruction layer. Other researchers emphasize the broader structural instability affecting the Late Bronze Age world. The collapse of major political powers, including the Hittite Empire, weakened the defensive networks that had previously protected important trade corridors. Without strong imperial authorities to maintain security along coastal regions, prosperous ports like Ugarit became increasingly vulnerable to attack and disruption. At the same time, economic stresses and shifting population movements may have intensified competition for resources and territory. Regardless of the precise causes, the destruction of Ugarit marked a significant turning point in the history of the Eastern Mediterranean. A city that had once served as a major center of international commerce suddenly disappeared from the regional landscape. The archives preserved within its ruins provide one of the final written records of the late Bronze Age trade system that had connected distant civilizations across the Mediterranean. With the disappearance of this important port, the maritime networks linking Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant were severely weakened. The collapse of these commercial routes contributed to a broader chain reaction affecting multiple regions dependent on long-distance trade. As coastal trade hubs were destroyed or abandoned, the consequences extended beyond the Levant and began to affect the interconnected economies of the wider Mediterranean world. In the decades following the destruction of Ugarit, evidence of disruption would also begin to appear further west across the Aegean region, where several major centers of the Bronze Age world were entering a period of dramatic transformation. The earliest recorded appearance of the Sea Peoples in Egyptian historical sources occurs during a military campaign fought along the western frontier of the Nile Delta in the late 13th century BCE. This conflict took place during the reign of Merneptah, a ruler of the New Kingdom Egypt and the successor of Ramesses II. Egyptian inscriptions commemorating the campaign describe a coalition of foreign groups who attempted to enter Egyptian territory in alliance with Libyan forces. The texts portray the event as a defensive war fought to protect the agricultural heartland of the Nile Delta. The campaign is documented in several royal inscriptions, including texts carved on temple walls and commemorative monuments. Among the most important of these records is the Merneptah stele, which provides an account of the pharaoh's victories over various foreign enemies. According to these inscriptions, Libyan groups from the western desert had assembled a coalition of allies and attempted to advance into the fertile regions of the Nile Delta. The coalition reportedly included several maritime peoples who had traveled into the region and joined the invasion. Egyptian texts identify a number of foreign groups participating in this alliance. Among the most frequently mentioned are the Shurden and the Shikalesh. These names appear in lists of captured or defeated enemies within the inscriptions commemorating the campaign. The texts describe them as foreign warriors equipped with distinctive weapons and armor that differed from those typically used by Egyptian soldiers. The Egyptian narrative describes the invading coalition as advancing toward the Nile Delta with the intention of seizing territory and resources. Control of this region was vital for Egypt because the delta contained some of the most productive agricultural lands in the kingdom. Grain produced in the delta supported both the population and the military forces of the Egyptian state. As a result, protecting this region was a central priority for the pharaoh and his administration. According to the inscriptions, Merneptah responded by mobilizing the Egyptian army and confronting the invading forces before they could establish a permanent presence in the delta. The texts describe the Egyptian military deploying chariot divisions, infantry units, and archers to confront the coalition. Egyptian reliefs and written accounts emphasize the disciplined organization of the royal army and its ability to repel the invaders through coordinated attacks. The outcome of the campaign is presented in the inscriptions as a decisive victory for Egypt. The texts claim that large numbers of enemy soldiers were killed during the battle and that many others were captured. Lists of prisoners recorded in the inscriptions include members of the Shurden and Shikalesh groups, indicating that these maritime peoples were present among the defeated forces. Egyptian officials also recorded the seizure of weapons, equipment, and livestock taken from the invading coalition. Royal inscriptions often served a propagandistic function, highlighting the successes of the reigning pharaoh while minimizing setbacks or losses. However, the repeated references to specific foreign groups suggest that the conflict described in the records reflects a real historical encounter. Archaeological evidence from Egyptian frontier regions confirms that the Nile Delta remained under Egyptian control during this period, supporting the claim that the invasion attempt was successfully repelled. The appearance of maritime groups alongside Libyan forces raises important questions about the nature of these early movements. Some historians suggest that the Sea Peoples may have initially participated in regional conflicts as mercenaries or allied warriors, rather than as independent invaders. Egyptian records from earlier periods mention the Shurden serving as soldiers within the Egyptian military itself. This indicates that interactions between Egyptian authorities and maritime populations may have included both conflict and cooperation. The campaign of Merneptah also demonstrates that the Sea Peoples were already active in the eastern Mediterranean before the more famous invasions recorded later in Egyptian history. Their participation in the Libyan coalition suggests that groups moving across maritime routes were beginning to interact with established political powers along the southern Mediterranean coast. These movements occurred during a period when several regions of the eastern Mediterranean were experiencing growing instability. Egyptian records emphasize the defensive nature of the campaign, portraying Merneptah as protecting the kingdom from external threats. The inscriptions describe the invading coalition as defeated and scattered, with surviving members fleeing the battlefield. The narrative reinforces the image of the pharaoh as the guardian of Egypt's borders and the defender of the Nile Valley's prosperity. Although the campaign ended with an Egyptian victory, it also revealed that new groups were beginning to appear along the Mediterranean frontiers of the Egyptian state. The presence of the Shurden, Shikalesh, and other maritime peoples in the conflict indicates that the movements later associated with the sea peoples were already underway by the late 13th century BCE. These early encounters foreshadowed the larger confrontations that would occur in the following generation. A few decades after the campaign of Merneptah, Egyptian inscriptions would record a far more extensive conflict involving multiple maritime groups advancing toward the Nile Delta. The scale of this later invasion would exceed the earlier coalition encountered during Merneptah's reign and would require a major military response from the Egyptian state. Egyptian reliefs carved into monumental temple walls depict one of the most dramatic military confrontations of the Late Bronze Age. These scenes portray large fleets of foreign ships approaching the Nile Delta, while columns of migrants advance along the coast with carts, livestock, and families. The images record the invasion that took place during the reign of Ramesses III, one of the last powerful rulers of the New Kingdom Egypt. Egyptian inscriptions describe this conflict as a major defensive campaign fought against a coalition of maritime groups collectively known today as the Sea Peoples. The most detailed records of this invasion appear at the temple complex of Medinet Habu. Built on the western bank of the Nile near Thebes, the temple served both as a religious center and as a monumental record of the pharaoh's achievements. Its walls contain extensive reliefs and hieroglyphic inscriptions documenting military campaigns conducted during the reign of Ramesses III. Among these records are several scenes depicting battles fought against foreign groups arriving by sea and land. According to the inscriptions, the invasion occurred during the early 12th century BCE, at a time when several regions of the eastern Mediterranean were already experiencing political instability. Egyptian scribes described the invading coalition as a collection of peoples who had moved through coastal territories before reaching the borders of Egypt. The texts claim that these groups had already destroyed cities in Anatolia and the Levant during their migrations. By the time they approached Egypt, they were traveling not only as military forces but also as communities carrying their possessions and families. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu identify several groups within this coalition. Among them are the Peleset, the Checker, and the Denyen. These names appear in hieroglyphic captions accompanying the reliefs and in written accounts describing the battle. Egyptian scribes portrayed these peoples as foreign groups moving together in a large coalition that threatened the stability of the eastern Mediterranean world. The visual scenes carved on the temple walls provide an unusually detailed depiction of the invading forces. In the reliefs, warriors are shown wearing distinctive helmets decorated with horns or feathered crests. They carry round shields, long swords, and spears while fighting aboard ships or advancing on land. These images differ noticeably from depictions of Egyptian soldiers, whose equipment included chariots, composite bows, and shields of different shapes. The contrast between these military styles suggests that the invading groups came from regions with distinct martial traditions. One of the most striking features of the Medinet Habu reliefs is the depiction of families traveling with the invading groups. Ox-drawn carts appear in several scenes carrying women, children, and household goods. These images indicate that the movement recorded in the inscriptions was not limited to organized military units. Instead, the coalition included migrating populations who were transporting their belongings as they moved through the eastern Mediterranean. This evidence has led historians to interpret the invasion as part of a broader migration process rather than a single military expedition. The inscriptions describe how Egyptian authorities prepared to confront the approaching coalition. According to the texts, Ramesses III ordered the mobilization of the Egyptian army and the fortification of strategic locations along the Nile Delta. The Delta region was particularly vulnerable because its river channels provided access routes into the interior of Egypt. Controlling these waterways was therefore essential for preventing enemy fleets from reaching the fertile agricultural lands of the Nile Valley. Egyptian reliefs depict a large naval engagement fought near the mouths of the Nile. In these scenes, Egyptian ships are shown confronting the vessels of the invading coalition in narrow waterways. Archers positioned on the decks of Egyptian ships and along the riverbanks fire arrows toward the approaching enemy fleets. Several foreign ships are shown colliding or overturning as Egyptian forces attack from multiple directions. The inscriptions accompanying these images describe the battle as a carefully coordinated defense designed to trap the invading fleet within the river channels. The naval engagement was followed by land battles fought along the coastal regions of the Nile Delta. Egyptian forces, including infantry and chariot units, confronted the remaining groups who had attempted to advance inland. According to the inscriptions, these engagements resulted in the defeat of the invading coalition and the capture of large numbers of prisoners. Egyptian officials recorded the names of captured groups and the quantities of weapons and equipment seized during the battle. Like many royal inscriptions from ancient Egypt, the records at Medinet Habu emphasized the success of the pharaoh and the strength of the Egyptian army. Nevertheless, the combination of visual depictions and written accounts provides historians with the most detailed contemporary evidence describing the Sea Peoples. No other source from the Late Bronze Age offers such extensive information about their appearance, equipment, and methods of warfare. Archaeologists and historians continue to study the reliefs in order to better understand the nature of the conflict. The ships depicted in the scenes, for example, appear to have high prows and sterns, suggesting designs suitable for long-distance travel across the Mediterranean. The equipment carried by the warriors also reflects technologies that were spreading across multiple regions during the transition from the Bronze Age to the early Iron Age. The invasion recorded during the reign of Ramesses III represents one of the largest military challenges faced by Egypt during the Late Bronze Age. The scale of the coalition and the presence of migrating populations indicate that the conflict formed part of a broader wave of movements affecting several regions of the Mediterranean world. Egyptian inscriptions portray the pharaoh's victory as a decisive defense of the Nile Valley, preventing the invading groups from establishing control within Egyptian territory. At the same time, the reliefs at Medinet Habu preserve valuable evidence about the composition and organization of the Sea Peoples. Through these detailed depictions, historians can observe the weapons, ships, and equipment used by the groups involved in the invasion. These visual records provide important clues about the military practices and maritime capabilities that shaped the conflicts of this period. By the early 12th century BCE, the Mediterranean had become a theater for some of the earliest documented naval battles in recorded history. Although maritime travel had long been essential for trade and communication across the region, the closing centuries of the Late Bronze Age saw increasing evidence that ships were also used in organized military operations. Written records and visual depictions indicate that coastal states relied on maritime mobility not only for commerce but also for the projection of military power across strategic waterways. Naval warfare during this period differed significantly from the large fleet engagements associated with later classical civilizations. Ships in the Late Bronze Age were primarily constructed for transportation and trade rather than for sustained naval combat. Merchant vessels carried cargo between ports, while state authorities occasionally adapted these ships for military purposes when coastal security was threatened. Because of this dual function, naval engagements often occurred close to shore where ships could rapidly deliver troops and supplies to land-based operations. The most detailed visual evidence for Late Bronze Age naval warfare appears in reliefs carved during the reign of Ramesses III. These depictions, preserved at the temple complex of Medinet Habu, illustrate the confrontation between Egyptian forces and coalitions of maritime groups associated with the Sea Peoples. The reliefs show fleets of ships engaged in close-range combat within the waterways of the Nile Delta. Egyptian vessels are depicted confronting enemy ships while archers fire arrows toward opposing crews. In these scenes, ships collide at short distances rather than maneuvering at long range. Warriors stand along the decks holding shields and weapons while attempting to board enemy vessels or repel attackers. The visual details suggest that naval engagements in the Late Bronze Age involved intense fighting between crews at close quarters. Archery played a major role in these encounters, with archers positioned along the sides of ships firing volleys at opposing forces. The design of the vessels depicted in these reliefs reflects the maritime technologies available during the Late Bronze Age. Most ships appear as long, narrow hulls with raised prows and sterns. These vessels were equipped with square sails supported by central masts, allowing them to harness favorable winds during longer voyages. At the same time, rows of oars provided propulsion when wind conditions were unfavorable or when precise maneuvering was required during combat. Archaeological discoveries and iconographic evidence suggest that these ships were capable of traveling considerable distances along Mediterranean coastlines. Their relatively shallow draft allowed them to approach beaches and river mouths where larger vessels might have difficulty navigating. This design made them well-suited for amphibious operations in which troops could be transported rapidly from ship to shore. The strategic importance of such mobility became increasingly evident during the final centuries of the Late Bronze Age. Coastal cities depended heavily on maritime trade for economic survival, yet many of these settlements lacked extensive fortifications facing the sea. Ships capable of approaching quickly and unloading armed warriors could therefore pose a serious threat to ports and trading hubs. Archaeological destruction layers found in several coastal cities indicate that maritime raids were capable of inflicting significant damage on vulnerable settlements. Naval operations were also closely connected to broader military strategies involving land forces. Ships often transported infantry units that could disembark near coastal targets and attack from the shore. In some cases, fleets may have coordinated their movements with migrating groups traveling along coastal routes. Egyptian reliefs depicting ox-drawn carts, accompanying the sea peoples suggest that maritime transport and overland migration could occur simultaneously during large-scale movements. The organization of naval forces during the Late Bronze Age remains a subject of ongoing research. Unlike later naval states, which maintained permanent fleets of specialized warships, many Bronze Age kingdoms appear to have relied on temporary mobilization of ships and crews. Merchant vessels and coastal craft could be requisitioned for military use when required, allowing rulers to assemble fleets capable of defending trade routes or confronting invading forces. The Egyptian response to maritime threats during the reign of Ramesses III illustrates how states adapted to these challenges. Reliefs at Medinet Habu depict Egyptian ships positioned within narrow waterways, where enemy vessels could be trapped and attacked from multiple directions. Archers stationed along riverbanks and on ship decks provided covering fire while infantry forces engaged enemy crews at close range. This combination of naval and land-based tactics allowed Egyptian forces to exploit the geography of the Nile Delta in their defense. Evidence from other regions of the eastern Mediterranean suggests that maritime conflict was not limited to Egyptian territory. Archaeological surveys across the Levant and Anatolia reveal that several coastal settlements experienced destruction during the same period, when Egyptian records describe conflicts with seaborne groups. These findings indicate that naval mobility allowed maritime populations to move rapidly between different coastal regions, spreading instability across wide areas. The development of naval warfare during the Late Bronze Age therefore reflected both technological capabilities and changing geopolitical conditions. Ships originally designed for trade and transport were increasingly used to carry warriors and conduct raids against vulnerable coastal targets. The ability to move quickly along maritime routes gave mobile groups a strategic advantage over states that depended primarily on land-based defenses. As maritime conflict intensified during the closing decades of the Bronze Age, the effectiveness of naval forces depended not only on ship design but also on the weapons and protective equipment carried by the warriors who fought aboard them. Egyptian reliefs depicting the sea peoples provide important visual evidence about the distinctive armor, shields, and weapons used by these maritime groups in their campaigns across the Mediterranean. Ancient Egyptian artists recorded unusually detailed images of the warriors who fought against the Egyptian state during the conflicts of the early 12th century BCE. These depictions appear primarily in the battle reliefs carved into the walls of Medinet Habu, where scenes of naval and land combat illustrate encounters between Egyptian forces and the groups later identified as the Sea Peoples. Through these reliefs, historians and archaeologists are able to observe the distinctive equipment carried by these foreign warriors, including their helmets, shields, and weapons. One of the most recognizable features in these depictions is the variety of helmets worn by the invading forces. Egyptian artists portrayed several helmet styles that differed from the protective headgear used by Egyptian soldiers. Some warriors are shown wearing helmets decorated with curved horns projecting upward from the sides. Others appear with tall crests made of feathers or plumes attached to the top of their helmets. These decorative elements were carefully carved into the reliefs, indicating that Egyptian artists considered them distinguishing features of the enemy forces. The horned helmet has become one of the most frequently cited visual markers associated with certain Sea Peoples groups. Archaeologists studying the reliefs have compared these images with similar helmet styles appearing in artistic traditions from parts of the Mediterranean. Some researchers have noted parallels between the horned helmets shown at Medinet Habu and later artistic representations found in regions such as the central Mediterranean. However, direct archaeological examples of these helmets remain rare, making it difficult to determine precisely where the design originated. In addition to distinctive helmets, the reliefs depict warriors carrying round shields that contrast sharply with the equipment used by Egyptian infantry. Egyptian soldiers are commonly shown holding tall rectangular shields designed to protect large portions of the body. By contrast, the warriors associated with the Sea Peoples appear with circular shields that were likely constructed from wood or leather stretched over a frame. These round shields would have allowed greater flexibility and mobility during close combat, particularly in the confined spaces of ships or during rapid assaults on coastal settlements. The weapons carried by these warriors also differ from the equipment typically used by Egyptian troops. Egyptian soldiers during the Late Bronze Age relied heavily on composite bows, spears, and short swords. The Sea Peoples depicted in the Medinet Habu reliefs, however, are often shown carrying longer swords designed for slashing movements rather than thrusting attacks. These weapons appear in the reliefs as elongated blades with tapered points and relatively simple hilts. Archaeologists have compared these depictions with surviving Bronze Age swords discovered in several Mediterranean regions. Some examples resemble what historians describe as Naui Type II swords, a style of long bronze blade that began appearing in the late 13th century BCE. These swords were more versatile than earlier dagger-like weapons and could be used effectively in both close combat and open battlefield conditions. The distribution of such swords across parts of the Aegean, Anatolia, and the central Mediterranean has led some scholars to suggest that similar weapons may have been carried by warriors involved in the movements associated with the Sea Peoples. Spears are also visible in several scenes from the Medinet Habu reliefs. Warriors are depicted holding long spear shafts with pointed bronze tips, which could be used both for throwing and for close combat. Spears were among the most common weapons throughout the ancient world due to their relative simplicity and effectiveness. When combined with shields and swords, they formed part of a standard infantry equipment set capable of functioning in a variety of battlefield situations. The equipment shown in these reliefs suggests that the Sea Peoples possessed a flexible military capability suited to both maritime and land-based operations. Warriors carrying round shields and long swords would have been able to maneuver easily on the decks of ships or during rapid disembarkation onto coastal terrain. The relatively light protective equipment depicted in the reliefs may have allowed these fighters to move quickly during raids or amphibious assaults. Another feature observed in the reliefs is the absence of heavy armor among many of the warriors. Unlike later ancient armies that relied on metal cuirasses or large body armor, the Sea Peoples appear to have worn limited protective gear beyond helmets and shields. This lighter equipment may have reflected the practical requirements of maritime warfare, where mobility and balance were essential for fighting aboard moving vessels. The careful representation of enemy equipment in Egyptian art was not merely decorative. Egyptian artists often recorded distinctive features of foreign peoples as a way of identifying them in official narratives. The different helmet types, shields, and weapons shown in the Medinet Habu reliefs therefore likely represent attempts to accurately portray the appearance of the groups encountered by Egyptian forces. These visual records provide historians with one of the most valuable sources of information about the material culture associated with the Sea Peoples. Archaeological discoveries across the eastern Mediterranean have occasionally produced artifacts that resemble the weapons depicted in the reliefs. Bronze swords, spearheads, and fragments of shields dating to the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE have been recovered from sites in Anatolia, the Levant, and the Aegean region. Although it is difficult to attribute specific artifacts directly to the Sea Peoples, the distribution of these items reflects the widespread circulation of similar military technologies during this transitional period between the Bronze and Iron Ages. The combination of distinctive weapons and maritime mobility allowed these warriors to operate effectively in a range of environments. Ships provided rapid transportation along coastal routes, while swords, shields, and spears enabled fighters to engage in both naval encounters and land-based combat after disembarking. This flexibility may have contributed to the success of maritime groups in attacking vulnerable ports and trading cities across the Mediterranean. The reliefs preserved at Medinet Habu therefore offer important insight into the equipment carried by the Sea Peoples during their campaigns. Through the careful observations of Egyptian artists, historians can reconstruct aspects of the weapons, armor, and martial practices associated with these groups. These depictions also reveal how the material culture of warfare was evolving during the final phases of the Bronze Age. While the equipment used by the Sea Peoples played a key role in their military effectiveness, their campaigns depended equally on the ships that transported these warriors across the Mediterranean. The design and mobility of these vessels allowed maritime groups to move rapidly between coastal regions, shaping the conflicts that marked the closing centuries of the Bronze Age. After the widespread disruptions that marked the closing decades of the Late Bronze Age, new communities began appearing along the southern coastline of the Levant. Archaeological evidence indicates that significant demographic and cultural changes occurred in this region during the early 12th century BCE. Among the most notable developments was the emergence of settlements associated with the people later known in historical sources as the Philistines. These communities established themselves along the coastal plains between southern Canaan and the eastern Mediterranean, occupying territory that would eventually be identified as Philistia. One of the earliest references to these populations appears in Egyptian inscriptions dating to the reign of Ramesses III. Reliefs and inscriptions preserved at Medinet Habu describe conflicts between Egyptian forces and groups identified as the Peleset. Many historians interpret the Peleset mentioned in these texts as the earliest recorded reference to the Philistines. The inscriptions depict these groups participating in the large coalition of maritime peoples that attempted to enter Egyptian territory during the early 12th century BCE. According to Egyptian accounts, these groups were defeated during the campaigns conducted along the Nile Delta. However, the inscriptions also suggest that some populations associated with the coalition were eventually settled by Egyptian authorities in parts of the southern Levant. Scholars interpret this development as part of a broader process in which displaced or migrating populations established new communities along the eastern Mediterranean coastline following the collapse of several Bronze Age political systems. Archaeological research conducted at sites along the southern Levantine coast provides important evidence supporting the presence of new cultural groups during this period. Excavations at major settlements such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron have revealed occupational layers dating to the early Iron Age that contain material culture distinct from earlier Canaanite traditions. These findings suggest that the population of the region experienced significant transformation around the beginning of the 12th century BCE. One of the most important indicators of this cultural shift appears in the pottery discovered at these sites. Archaeologists have identified ceramic styles that differ markedly from those produced in earlier Late Bronze Age Canaanite contexts. Many vessels feature decorative patterns and shapes that resemble pottery traditions associated with the Aegean world. These ceramics, often referred to as Philistine bichrome ware, display painted geometric designs and color schemes similar to those found in Mycenaean pottery. The appearance of these pottery styles shortly after 1200 BCE has led scholars to propose that some elements of the population settling in the southern Levant may have originated from regions influenced by Aegean cultural traditions. While the precise migration routes remain uncertain, the distribution of these ceramics suggests that connections existed between the eastern Mediterranean and communities further west during the transitional period between the Bronze and Iron Ages. In addition to pottery, other aspects of material culture from early Philistine settlements also demonstrate distinctive characteristics. Excavations have uncovered architectural features that differ from earlier local building traditions. Some structures display courtyard layouts and construction techniques that resemble patterns found in parts of the Aegean and Anatolia. Although these similarities do not necessarily indicate direct migration from a single region, they provide evidence that cultural influences from multiple areas were present within these emerging communities. Food remains discovered in archaeological contexts also reveal changes in dietary practices during the early Iron Age. Analysis of animal bones recovered from Philistine sites indicates a higher frequency of pig consumption compared to earlier Canaanite settlements, where pigs were less commonly eaten. This shift in dietary patterns may reflect the introduction of new cultural preferences among populations settling in the region. Archaeologists also note changes in household artifacts and tools associated with domestic life. Cooking vessels, hearth installations, and storage containers from early Philistine settlements often differ from those used by earlier inhabitants of the region. These differences suggest that incoming populations maintained aspects of their own cultural traditions while gradually adapting to local environmental and economic conditions. The geographical location of these settlements played an important role in shaping the development of Philistine society. The southern Levantine coast provided access to maritime trade routes that connected the eastern Mediterranean with regions across the Aegean and Anatolia. Coastal plains also offered fertile agricultural land capable of supporting growing populations. These environmental advantages made the region an attractive destination for groups seeking new territories following the disruptions of the Bronze Age collapse. Over time, the communities established by the Philistines developed into a network of interconnected urban centers. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that several major cities emerged as focal points of political and economic activity within the region. Settlements such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, and Gath later formed a loose political confederation commonly described by historians as the Philistine Pentapolis. These cities were typically fortified and strategically positioned near both agricultural zones and maritime routes. Their location allowed them to participate in regional trade networks while also controlling access to inland territories. The growth of these urban centers suggests that the Philistines rapidly adapted to the political landscape of the early Iron Age Levant, establishing stable communities capable of sustaining long-term settlement. The arrival of the Philistines therefore represents an important phase in the broader transformation of the eastern Mediterranean following the collapse of late Bronze Age states. Archaeological evidence indicates that migrating populations did not simply conduct raids against coastal regions, but also established permanent settlements that became integrated into the regional political system. These communities would later play a significant role in the history of the southern Levant during the early Iron Age. As these settlements expanded, the coastal cities founded by the Philistines developed into organized urban centers with defensive structures, administrative institutions, and economic connections extending throughout the region. Their emergence marked the beginning of a new political landscape in the Levant during the centuries following the Bronze Age collapse. Archaeological excavations at key southern Levantine sites have provided extensive insight into the formation and development of early Philistine cities. Principal settlements such as Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Ashdod reveal evidence of organized urban development beginning shortly after 1200 BCE. These sites indicate that the Philistines established prosperous, fortified centers capable of supporting both local populations and trade networks, extending throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Excavations demonstrate that the material culture of these cities was a synthesis of external influences and local Levantine traditions. Pottery from the earliest occupation layers displays characteristics strongly reminiscent of Mycenaean ceramics, including bichrome painted decoration, geometric motifs, and specific vessel forms such as craters and jugs. Archaeologists note that these styles, often referred to as Philistine bichrome ware, appear consistently across multiple settlements in the first phases of occupation. Over time, these imported or imitation forms evolved into locally produced variations, incorporating Levantine clay sources and decorative conventions while retaining some stylistic elements from the Aegean. Architectural remains further illustrate the combination of external influence and adaptation to local conditions. Excavations at Ekron and Ashkelon reveal courtyard-style houses and multi-room structures with thick mud brick walls, a layout reminiscent of earlier Canaanite urban design but with modifications that reflect the social organization of the incoming populations. Defensive structures such as city walls and gates were constructed using locally available stone, providing security against both inland and maritime threats while demonstrating a continuity of Levantine engineering practices. Material evidence also points to complex urban planning within Philistine cities. Streets were laid out to facilitate movement and access to public and private spaces, while designated storage areas indicate systematic management of food and resources. Archaeological layers reveal storage jars, granaries, and specialized installations for production activities, suggesting that these urban centers operated with a degree of administrative oversight that supported both domestic life and economic activity. Other artifacts recovered from these sites demonstrate the integration of cultural practices and technological knowledge from multiple regions. Metalworking tools, weights and measures, and imported luxury items indicate active participation in long-distance trade networks. Jewelry, figurines, and decorative objects illustrate a blending of Aegean and Levantine stylistic motifs, reflecting the interplay between migrant populations and local communities in shaping material culture. Urban cemeteries provide additional insight into the social and cultural identity of early Philistine populations. Burial practices, including the orientation of interments, grave goods, and funerary constructions, display features that differ from those of contemporary Canaanite populations. Some graves include imported pottery and personal items consistent with Aegean traditions, suggesting the preservation of cultural memory among migrant groups. Over successive generations, burial practices gradually assimilated local customs, highlighting the process of integration into the broader Levantine society. The prosperity of Philistine cities is further evidenced by their participation in regional trade networks. Archaeological finds indicate that goods such as olive oil, wine, and ceramics were produced and exchanged locally, while luxury items, including imported metals, glass, and faience, traveled through these ports from Anatolia, Cyprus, and Egypt. The strategic location of these cities along maritime routes allowed the Philistines to connect with both Western and Eastern Mediterranean networks, consolidating their role as economic intermediaries during the early Iron Age. Excavations at Ashdod, for example, reveal extensive fortifications, storage facilities, and evidence of sustained occupation over several centuries. The combination of defensive structures and evidence of trade activity indicates that these cities functioned as both military strongpoints and commercial hubs. Similar patterns are observed at Gaza and Ashkelon, where archaeological layers suggest continuous urban occupation accompanied by material evidence of craft production, metallurgy, and organized agriculture. Together, these archaeological observations indicate that the Philistines rapidly established urban centers that balanced cultural continuity with adaptation to local environments. The combination of imported traditions and local practices demonstrates a dynamic process in which migrating populations were not merely imposed upon the Levant, but actively engaged with existing cultural and economic systems. Material evidence reveals a society capable of sustaining urban life, maintaining defensive capacities, and participating in the larger Eastern Mediterranean economy. The evolution of these cities provides a foundation for understanding how the Philistines transitioned from displaced maritime groups to established regional powers. As their settlements expanded, they became deeply integrated into economic, social, and political networks that connected the southern Levant with distant Mediterranean regions. The archaeological record highlights both the persistence of Aegean-inspired cultural practices and the gradual adaptation to local environmental, social, and economic conditions. By examining the material remains of early Philistine cities, historians can trace the processes of cultural interaction, adaptation, and urban development that defined the initial settlement phase. This evidence sets the stage for understanding the political, economic, and military role that Philistine communities would play in the centuries following the collapse of the late Bronze Age empires. Archaeological evidence from southern Levantine settlements provides a detailed view of daily life among early Philistine communities during the early Iron Age. Excavations at cities such as Ashkelon and Ekron reveal extensive residential areas, workshops, and storage installations dating to the 12th and 11th centuries BCE. These findings demonstrate that the Philistines were not merely transient raiders but established urban populations engaged in a diverse range of social and economic activities. Household remains indicate that early Philistine communities operated mixed economies combining agriculture, livestock husbandry, and craft production. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of grain storage facilities, granaries, and small-scale workshops producing ceramic vessels, tools, and other household items. Animal bones from domestic sites show that communities raised sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, suggesting both subsistence farming and participation in local trade networks. Analysis of food preparation areas, hearths, and storage containers provides further insight into the diets and domestic practices of these populations. Pottery evidence is particularly informative for understanding cultural continuity and adaptation. Early ceramic assemblages at Philistine settlements display styles strongly reminiscent of late Bronze Age Aegean traditions, including painted motifs, bichrome decoration, and specific vessel forms such as craters and jugs. These imported or imitation styles indicate that migrant groups maintained elements of their original cultural identity following their settlement along the southern Levantine coast. Over time, however, locally produced pottery gradually became dominant, reflecting adaptation to Levantine materials, techniques, and aesthetic conventions. Domestic architecture further illustrates the degree of urbanization within these communities. Excavated houses often feature multi-roomed layouts with designated spaces for cooking, storage, and sleeping. Courtyard designs and mud brick construction techniques suggest both continuity with earlier Canaanite building traditions and modifications introduced by migrant populations. The arrangement of streets and residential blocks indicates deliberate urban planning, facilitating access to public spaces, workshops, and marketplaces. Craft production within early Philistine settlements was diverse and specialized. Archaeologists have uncovered installations for pottery manufacturing, weaving, and metallurgy. Loom weights and spindle whorls provide evidence of textile production, while kilns and workshops indicate organized ceramic production for both domestic use and trade. Metal tools and weapons recovered from domestic contexts suggest that artisans were able to produce functional items to support agriculture, construction, and defense. Material culture also reveals aspects of social organization within these communities. The presence of standardized weights, storage vessels, and specialized production tools suggests coordinated management of resources, likely overseen by local authorities or household heads. Household remains, combined with evidence of public infrastructure such as city walls and gates, indicate that early Philistine cities were organized communities with both private and communal spaces supporting economic and social life. Dietary evidence highlights the integration of new cultural practices alongside local traditions. Zooarchaeological analysis demonstrates that pig consumption was higher in Philistine settlements than in neighboring Canaanite communities, reflecting dietary preferences imported from Aegean regions. Meanwhile, grains, legumes, and domesticated animals formed the basis of subsistence, consistent with environmental and agricultural conditions of the southern coastal plains. Storage facilities and granaries indicate systematic management of food resources to support urban populations. Evidence from domestic artifacts also illustrates the daily routines of household members. Pottery vessels for cooking and storage, hearths, and utensils show that residents engaged in regular food preparation and domestic labor. Craft tools such as spindle whorls and loom weights suggest that textile production was primarily organized within households, supporting both local needs and exchange within regional networks. These findings indicate that early Philistine communities maintained a degree of economic self-sufficiency while participating in broader commercial systems. Urban settlement patterns reflect the social cohesion of these communities. Residential clusters often include multiple structures arranged around courtyards or shared spaces, suggesting cooperative household organization and the integration of extended families. The combination of living, working, and storage areas within individual compounds demonstrates that daily life was closely tied to both production and family structures. These material traces provide a clear picture of how migrant populations established stable urban societies within a few generations. The integration of imported cultural traditions with local Levantine practices reflects both continuity and adaptation. Early Philistine settlements were not isolated enclaves. Rather, they were active participants in regional trade networks, capable of producing goods for both domestic consumption and exchange with neighboring communities. The urbanization and economic organization evident in sites such as Ashkelon and Ekron laid the foundation for broader social and political development. Households operated as units of production, consumption, and trade, while communal infrastructure facilitated the management of resources and defense. These settlements demonstrate that early Philistine cities were fully developed urban centers with social hierarchies, specialized labor, and economic resilience. Beyond daily life, the material culture and settlement organization also provide insight into the cultural identity and integration strategies of these communities. The combination of Aegean-inspired pottery, local architectural practices, and participation in Levantine economic networks reflects a society negotiating continuity with its past and adaptation to its new environment. These dynamics set the stage for the development of religious, political, and cultural institutions that would characterize Philistine society in subsequent centuries. Religious life played a central role in the formation and cohesion of early Philistine communities along the southern Levantine coast. Excavations at key sites such as Ashdod and Ekron reveal complex ritual installations, including temples, altars, and associated cultic objects, indicating the presence of organized religious institutions by the early Iron Age. These sites suggest that ritual activity was an integral part of urban life and that religious structures served both spiritual and social functions within the emerging Philistine cities. Archaeological evidence shows that Philistine temples were often constructed within the urban core, providing accessible spaces for worship and communal gatherings. Excavated altars and offering tables demonstrate structured practices of ritual sacrifice, primarily involving domesticated animals. Analysis of animal bones from temple contexts indicates that sheep, goats, and cattle were commonly used in these ceremonies. These practices align with broader Levantine traditions while also reflecting possible influences from Aegean ritual forms brought by migrant populations. Ceremonial pottery forms a significant component of Philistine religious material culture. Excavations have recovered a range of vessels designed for use in ritual contexts, including libation bowls, juglets, and small offering containers. Many of these ceramics exhibit painted decoration consistent with early Philistine bichrome ware, suggesting that imported or Aegean-influenced artistic conventions were incorporated into local religious practice. These objects indicate that ritual activity was not solely functional, but also visually and symbolically expressive, reinforcing communal identity. Figurines and symbolic objects further illuminate the religious landscape of Philistine cities. Archaeologists have recovered anthropomorphic and zoomorphic figurines interpreted as representations of deities, protective spirits, or ritual attendants. Some figurines display stylistic elements characteristic of the Aegean world, such as exaggerated features or specific postures, while others incorporate Levantine motifs. This combination of influences suggests that early Philistine religion was syncretic, blending inherited cultural forms with local traditions to create a distinctive system of worship. Textual and historical sources later associate the Philistines with deities such as Dagon. Biblical references describe temples dedicated to Dagon in cities including Ashdod and Gaza, indicating that the cult of this deity became central to civic and religious life. While these textual sources postdate the initial settlement period, archaeological findings suggest that the integration of Levantine religious forms began early in the Iron Age and developed alongside the continuation of Aegean-derived rituals. Spatial analysis of temple complexes shows careful organization within the urban landscape. Temples often occupy elevated or prominent locations, emphasizing visibility and access, while courtyards and open spaces facilitated congregational gatherings and public rituals. Storage areas associated with these structures indicate that offerings, votive gifts, and ritual materials were systematically managed, suggesting formalized religious administration and institutional oversight. Ritual activity also appears to have played a role in unifying communities composed of diverse cultural backgrounds. The early Philistine cities were founded by populations migrating from the Aegean or other Mediterranean regions and settling among established Levantine inhabitants. Structured religious practices, conducted in formalized temple spaces and reinforced by shared ceremonies, likely helped integrate these heterogeneous populations, providing a collective framework for civic identity and social cohesion. Evidence of ritualized practices extends beyond temple walls. Courtyard installations, hearths, and altars found in domestic contexts suggest that household-level religious observances supplemented public ceremonies. The use of specialized ceramic forms, small figurines, and miniature altars indicates that individual families participated in devotional activities alongside the broader civic rituals. This combination of public and private worship underscores the centrality of religion in daily life and community organization. Comparative analysis of Philistine religious material culture highlights the persistence of imported traditions alongside local adaptation. Ceramics, figurines, and cultic practices reveal the continued influence of Aegean forms in the early Iron Age, while architectural choices, animal offerings, and cultic motifs demonstrate Levantine integration. Together, these elements reflect a process of cultural synthesis in which migrating populations preserved aspects of their heritage while adopting practices from their new environment. The study of Philistine temples and ritual artifacts also provides insight into the administrative and organizational capacities of these communities. Temple complexes required coordination of resources, labor, and materials, suggesting that religious institutions were intertwined with the civic and economic life of the city. The management of offerings, ceremonial spaces, and associated goods indicates a structured approach to sustaining ritual activity over time. Through these archaeological and textual records, historians can trace the ways in which early Philistine religion functioned as both a cultural and social instrument. Temples and ritual objects not only reflect belief systems but also illustrate mechanisms of integration, identity formation, and community cohesion. By examining these practices, scholars gain a clearer understanding of how the Philistines transitioned from migrating maritime groups into fully organized urban societies. As religious and cultural practices evolved, early Philistine communities increasingly interacted with neighboring Iron Age societies. Temples and rituals provided points of contact and exchange, allowing the Philistines to participate in regional networks while maintaining distinct cultural identities. This interaction set the stage for political, economic, and social integration within the broader context of the southern Levant during the early Iron Age. During the early Iron Age, Philistine city-states along the southern Levantine coast engaged in recurring conflicts with neighboring highland communities. Archaeological and textual evidence, including biblical narratives and material remains, indicate that these confrontations often involve disputes over arable land, water resources, and control of trade routes connecting the interior to coastal ports. The competition for these strategic resources contributed to a pattern of sustained military engagement between coastal and inland populations during the 11th and 10th centuries BCE. Excavations at major Philistine sites such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron reveal extensive fortifications, including thick mud-brick walls, gates, and towers, reflecting the necessity of defending urban centers from both maritime and inland threats. These defensive structures indicate that warfare was an ongoing concern for Philistine populations and shaped urban planning and settlement organization. The presence of weapons caches, including bronze swords, spearheads, and arrow points, further corroborates the militarized environment in which these cities developed. Biblical texts describe numerous engagements between Philistine cities and early Israelite groups. Accounts highlight the capture and defense of fortified highland settlements, raids on agricultural areas, and clashes over trade routes linking the interior to the Mediterranean coast. While the historicity of some narratives remains debated, archaeological corroboration, including evidence of destruction layers at highland sites, shifts in settlement patterns, and the appearance of weaponry, confirms that these interactions were characterized by intermittent conflict and shifting territorial control. Control over fertile agricultural zones was a major source of tension. Highland communities sought access to grain, olive oil, and other essential resources, while Philistine cities relied on these products for both subsistence and trade. Archaeological survey of rural sites adjacent to Philistine settlements indicates that highland communities sometimes fortified their villages or strategically positioned themselves along trade corridors to maintain economic leverage. These dynamics created a persistent cycle of skirmishes, raids, and defensive measures across the southern Levant. Maritime connectivity allowed the Philistines to mobilize resources and troops efficiently along the coast, giving them a strategic advantage in projecting power toward inland regions. Evidence from coastal installations, such as ship depots and harbor-related infrastructure, suggests that Philistine cities were capable of both defending their territory and supporting offensive operations against inland communities. This combination of maritime mobility and fortified urban centers facilitated sustained engagement with emerging Israelite groups over extended periods. Ceramic and material culture studies from this period also provide indirect evidence of conflict. Archaeologists have identified layers of ash and partial destruction at both Philistin and highland sites, often associated with late 12th and 11th century BCE occupation phases. These layers coincide with shifts in settlement patterns, including the consolidation of some highland villages and the abandonment of others. The correlation between these archaeological indicators and textual accounts reinforces the interpretation of sustained military competition. The development of military strategies in both coastal and inland communities is reflected in weapon assemblages and defensive architecture. Philistin cities display evidence of organized infantry equipped with bronze swords, spears, and shields, alongside archery units capable of operating within urban and maritime environments. Highland settlements similarly adapted to threats through stone fortifications, strategic hilltop locations, and tactical use of terrain for defense. The interaction between these different approaches shaped regional military practices and informed subsequent Iron Age warfare in the southern Levant. These ongoing conflicts had broader social and political implications. The need for coordinated defense encouraged the emergence of leadership structures capable of mobilizing urban populations for military purposes. Archaeological evidence of administrative buildings, storage facilities for provisions, and weapons production sites suggests that both Philistin and highland communities invested in sustaining organized martial capabilities. This indicates that warfare influenced not only settlement patterns but also the political and economic organization of early Iron Age societies. While localized competition with highland groups dominated much of Philistin military activity during the 11th and 10th centuries BCE, it is important to situate these conflicts within a wider geopolitical context. At the same time, a larger imperial power emerging in Mesopotamia and Syria was beginning to exert influence over the region. The presence of external political entities introduced additional pressure on both coastal and inland communities, influencing alliances, trade relations, and military strategy. By the end of this period, the interactions between Philistin city-states and neighboring Israelite groups illustrate a pattern of territorial contestation, resource management, and defensive innovation. Archaeological and textual evidence together provide a picture of a highly competitive landscape in which emerging states negotiated power through warfare, urban fortification, and control of critical economic corridors. These dynamics set the stage for subsequent regional conflicts and the integration of Philistin cities into broader Iron Age networks. By the 9th century BCE, the political dynamics of the southern Levant were profoundly affected by the westward expansion of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Assyrian kings, seeking to control trade routes, secure resources, and assert dominance over peripheral states, launched campaigns into the Levantine corridor connecting Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. This period marks the first sustained interaction between the Philistin cities and a major imperial power originating from Mesopotamia. Royal inscriptions from successive Assyrian rulers, including Shalmaneser III and Tiglath-Pileser III, document military campaigns against regional Levantine states. These texts indicate that the objective of Assyrian campaigns was not merely conquest but also the imposition of systematic tribute obligations. Cities and territories that submitted to Assyria were required to provide gold, silver, agricultural produce, and manpower to support imperial administration and military operations. The inscriptions specifically mention coastal cities such as Ashkelon and Gaza, signaling that these settlements were integrated into Assyrian political and economic networks. Archaeological evidence supports these textual accounts. Excavations at Ashkelon and Gaza reveal destruction layers, remodeling of fortifications, and administrative installations dating to the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, consistent with periods of Assyrian intervention. These layers suggest that imperial campaigns were followed by reorganization of urban infrastructure to facilitate Assyrian oversight, including the storage and collection of tribute. Material culture indicates that, while local governance structures remained partially intact, ultimate authority was exercised by Assyrian officials or local rulers acting under imperial mandate. Philistin cities responded to Assyrian expansion through a combination of resistance and accommodation. Fortifications were reinforced in anticipation of military incursions, while diplomatic correspondence with Assyrian rulers and neighboring states indicates negotiation and submission as alternative strategies to outright confrontation. For example, Tiglath-Pileser III's annals describe the submission of coastal cities and the installation of compliant rulers, demonstrating that political autonomy was increasingly constrained under imperial authority. The strategic objectives of the Neo-Assyrian Empire emphasized control over key maritime and inland trade routes. Coastal Philistine cities served as crucial nodes for the movement of goods between Egypt, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. Assyrian campaigns aimed to secure these economic corridors, ensuring a steady flow of tribute while preventing rival powers from exploiting coastal connections. This integration into the Assyrian system altered the economic orientation of Philistine cities, directing production and trade toward fulfilling imperial requirements. Evidence of Assyrian influence is also visible in the material culture of Philistine settlements. Imported luxury items, standardized weights, and inscriptions written in Akkadian or bearing Assyrian administrative marks appear in archaeological layers dating to this period. Such findings indicate the imposition of Assyrian bureaucratic practices and the diffusion of imperial cultural markers into local contexts, reflecting both political subordination and cultural interaction. The imposition of Assyrian authority fundamentally reshaped the regional power balance. While Philistine cities maintained a degree of internal governance, their capacity to act independently in military, diplomatic, or economic matters was substantially reduced. Coastal cities that had previously exercised influence over trade and highland interactions were now required to navigate imperial expectations, including tribute delivery, military support, and compliance with administrative directives. These obligations limited the strategic flexibility that had previously allowed the Philistines to compete with neighboring kingdoms. Despite Assyrian control, Philistine communities continued to participate in local and regional networks, adapting to the constraints imposed by imperial dominance. Urban populations maintained craft production, agriculture, and trade, but the allocation of resources increasingly served imperial interests. This adaptation illustrates the resilience of Philistine society while simultaneously marking the gradual erosion of the independent authority that characterized the early Iron Age city-states. By the end of the 8th century BCE, the expansion of the Neo-Assyrian Empire had effectively incorporated most Philistine cities into its political framework. Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Ashdod were either directly controlled or maintained under heavy tribute obligations, reducing the independent power of the Philistine pentapolis. The integration of these cities into the Assyrian administrative and military system transformed the southern Levant from a network of competing city-states into a region operating under imperial oversight. The rise of Assyria thus represents a critical turning point in the history of the Philistines. The combination of military campaigns, tribute systems, and administrative control reshaped the political, economic, and social landscape of the southern Levant. Under imperial domination, the independent authority of the Philistine cities declined, setting the stage for further regional transformations during the Late Iron Age and the eventual integration of the area into subsequent empires. By the Late Iron Age, the Philistine cities of the southern Levant had been systematically incorporated into the administrative frameworks of regional empires, particularly the Neo-Assyrian state. Cities such as Ashkelon, Gaza, and Ekron were subject to regular tribute obligations, military oversight, and the broader economic and political mechanisms of imperial governance. Assyrian royal inscriptions record the submission of these urban centers, detailing both tribute payments and the presence of imperial officials tasked with ensuring compliance. The integration of Philistine cities into such systems reduced the autonomy of local rulers and introduced standardized administrative practices, including taxation, record-keeping, and conscription for military service. Archaeological evidence corroborates these textual sources. Excavations in Philistine cities reveal structural modifications consistent with administrative restructuring, including storage facilities designed for tribute collection, public installations to monitor trade, and fortifications adapted to align with imperial defense requirements. Material culture from these layers demonstrates both continuity and adaptation. While local pottery, tools, and domestic practices persisted, imported Assyrian artifacts and standardized administrative objects indicate the presence of imperial influence in daily operations. This combination illustrates the gradual embedding of Philistine communities within the economic and political frameworks of the empire. Military integration was a key mechanism through which the Neo-Assyrian state exerted control. Assyrian rulers required subject cities to provide troops for campaigns, ensuring loyalty while also redirecting local military capacity toward imperial objectives. Evidence from inscriptions and archaeological finds suggests that Philistine warriors were incorporated into regional levies and sometimes stationed outside their home cities under the supervision of imperial authorities. This conscription system diminished the independent martial capacity of the Philistine city-states, which had previously relied on local militias to defend coastal trade routes and urban centers. The economic dimension of imperial integration further altered Philistine society. Tribute obligations required the regular transfer of agricultural produce, luxury goods, and metals to imperial centers in Mesopotamia. Urban centers such as Ashkelon and Ekron adapted their production systems to meet these demands, reorganizing craft workshops, storage facilities, and trade networks to supply both local and imperial needs. Archaeological layers reveal the construction of standardized storage jars and administrative implements, reflecting both the logistical organization required for tribute and the broader influence of Assyrian economic practices on local production. Cultural implications accompanied these political and economic transformations. As Philistine cities became more closely integrated into imperial systems, distinctive practices associated with their sea people's heritage, such as Aegean-derived pottery styles, architectural conventions, and ritual forms, gradually diminished. Material evidence shows a shift toward locally Levantine or imperial standardized forms in both domestic and ceremonial contexts. While vestiges of earlier traditions persisted for several generations, the cumulative effect of political oversight, economic integration, and cultural exchange facilitated the gradual assimilation of Philistine communities into the broader regional milieu. Religious life was similarly influenced by imperial structures. Temples and cultic installations continued to function within Philistine cities, but evidence indicates that ritual practices increasingly incorporated elements consistent with Levantine and Mesopotamian norms. Offerings, ceremonial pottery, and votive objects align more closely with regional standards, suggesting that the imperial presence exerted a homogenizing influence on both public and private religious observance. This process contributed to the gradual erosion of distinct cultural markers previously associated with the Philistine migrants. The administrative and military reorganization also affected urban governance. Local rulers who had once exercised considerable autonomy were now subordinate to imperial authorities, responsible for implementing taxation, conscription, and trade regulations imposed from afar. Inscriptional evidence records appointments of governors or overseers loyal to Assyria, illustrating a system in which local leadership operated within defined limits set by the imperial center. The diminishing authority of traditional leadership structures reflects a broader trend in which independent city-states were transformed into provincial administrative units. By the end of the 8th century BCE, these processes of integration had effectively dissolved the independent political identity of the Philistine city-states. While the population maintained continuity in settlement patterns, economic activity, and some cultural traditions, the influence of imperial administration and regional assimilation resulted in the gradual fading of the sea people's distinct social and political characteristics. The convergence of military, economic, and religious control facilitated both the practical management of these cities and the absorption of their populations into broader regional networks. As a result, the Philistines, once identifiable as a distinct group of migrating maritime peoples, increasingly became part of the imperial and Levantine societal framework. Political independence had diminished, economic obligations were redirected to imperial centers, and cultural expression gradually aligned with dominant regional norms. This transformation set the stage for the final stages of their integration into successive empires and the eventual historical disappearance of the distinct sea people's identity in the southern Levant. Archaeological evidence from Philistine settlements indicates that, over several centuries, the descendants of sea people's migrants became increasingly integrated into the broader cultural landscape of the southern Levant. Material culture from later Iron Age layers, particularly those dating to the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, demonstrates convergence with neighboring Levantine populations. Pottery styles, architectural forms, and urban layouts previously associated with Aegean-derived Philistine traditions gradually aligned with regional norms, reflecting both practical adaptation and long-term social assimilation. Linguistic evidence provides additional insight into this process. Inscriptions and written records from Philistine cities show a gradual adoption of local Semitic languages for administrative, commercial, and religious purposes. By the late Iron Age, the distinct Aegean-derived linguistic elements once associated with migrant populations had largely disappeared, supplanted by Phoenician, Hebrew, and other regional dialects. This linguistic integration facilitated trade, diplomacy, and social interaction with neighboring communities, further embedding Philistine populations into the regional network. Religious practices similarly evolved under the influence of local traditions. While early Iron Age temples preserved elements of Aegean cultic forms, later sites reflect adoption of Levantine deities, rituals, and ceremonial objects. Cults centered on Dagon and other Philistine deities persisted in name but were increasingly incorporated into a shared religious environment with Canaanite, Aramean, and Israelite populations. Archaeological analysis of votive deposits, altars, and sacrificial remains indicates a blending of ritual forms, suggesting that cultural and religious assimilation was both widespread and gradual. Artistic and craft production further illustrates the convergence of Philistine communities with surrounding societies. Later ceramic assemblages show a shift towards standardized Levantine forms, abandoning earlier bichrome Aegean-influenced designs. Metalwork, jewelry, and domestic tools reflect regional techniques and styles, rather than distinct Philistine innovations. These changes indicate not only the adoption of local artistic conventions, but also the participation of Philistine artisans in regional economic and cultural networks. The process of assimilation was influenced by both internal and external factors. Politically, integration into imperial systems, particularly under Neo-Assyrian and later Neo-Babylonian control, imposed administrative, military, and economic structures that encouraged conformity to broader regional norms. Socially, intermarriage, migration, and commerce facilitated the blending of populations and the transmission of local customs. Over time, these cumulative pressures contributed to the gradual erosion of distinct sea peoples' identity while maintaining continuity in settlement and economic activity. Archaeological layers also reveal continuity in settlement patterns alongside assimilation. Cities such as Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron remained occupied, maintaining their urban infrastructure, marketplaces, and agricultural systems. However, the material record shows increasing homogeneity with neighboring Levantine cities, suggesting that, while these communities continued to function as urban centers, their cultural distinctiveness was progressively absorbed into the regional milieu. By the end of the Iron Age, Philistine populations had largely merged with surrounding societies. Distinctive markers of sea peoples' origin, such as Aegean-influenced pottery, specific architectural forms, and early ritual practices, were no longer prevalent. Instead, the material culture, language, and social practices of these communities were indistinguishable from those of other Levantine populations. This convergence illustrates how cultural identity can transform over generations through sustained interaction, political integration, and social adaptation. Although the Philistine communities themselves had assimilated, historical and textual records preserved memories of their origins. Egyptian inscriptions, biblical references, and later historiographical accounts continued to identify these populations as descendants of the Sea Peoples, maintaining a record of their migrations and early cultural traits even after the communities had lost their distinct identity. These sources provide modern scholars with critical insights into the processes of migration, settlement, and cultural transformation that shaped the southern Levant during the early and late Iron Age. The archaeological and textual evidence together demonstrates that the disappearance of Sea Peoples' identity was a prolonged, multi-generational process rather than a sudden event. Through linguistic, religious, artistic, and social assimilation, migrant populations gradually became integrated into Levantine society, while leaving behind a legacy documented in both material culture and historical records. This transformation underscores the broader dynamics of cultural change in the ancient Mediterranean world, where migration, conflict, and imperial influence could reshape the identities of entire populations over time. Modern scholarship on the Sea Peoples emerged primarily from the study of Egyptian inscriptions in the 19th century. Early Egyptologists, including Champollion and Lepsius, documented and interpreted hieroglyphic texts describing foreign invaders along the Nile Delta. The reliefs at Medinet Habu proved especially significant, providing vivid depictions of large fleets, warriors, and migrating populations. These carvings illustrated both the scale of the threat posed by the Sea Peoples and the organized defensive measures taken by Ramesses III, offering a unique visual record unavailable from other contemporary sources. Subsequent archaeological excavations across the Levant and Aegean regions provided material evidence consistent with the textual records. Sites such as Ugarit, Ashkelon, and Troy revealed destruction layers dating to the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, suggesting widespread societal disruption coinciding with the period of Sea Peoples activity. These layers often contained burned buildings, abandoned administrative centers, and shifts in material culture, supporting the interpretation of migration and conflict events described in Egyptian texts. The integration of epigraphic and archaeological data allowed scholars to construct a more comprehensive narrative of the Late Bronze Age Mediterranean. The combination of textual descriptions, reliefs, and stratigraphic evidence demonstrates that the Sea Peoples were not isolated raiders but part of broader population movements affecting multiple regions. Excavated settlements show changes in urban planning, material culture, and fortification systems, illustrating both the immediate impact of violent incursions and the longer-term processes of settlement and assimilation. In the Aegean, analysis of pottery and architectural remains at sites, such as Mycenae and Santorini, highlights the collapse of previous palatial systems. Abandoned palaces and the sudden cessation of large-scale construction projects correspond chronologically with the movements of maritime groups along the eastern Mediterranean. Material evidence, including shifts in ceramic styles and the disappearance of linear B administrative tablets, points to a breakdown in political and economic structures similar to those recorded in Egypt and the Levant. In addition to settlement patterns, burial practices provide insight into population movement and cultural interaction. Changes in funerary architecture and grave goods suggest that some migrating populations maintained aspects of their Aegean heritage, while gradually integrating with local Levantine customs. Analysis of isotopic and genetic data from skeletal remains at sites such as Ashkelon and Ekron indicates a mix of local and migrant ancestry, confirming that the Sea Peoples were not solely destructive but also involved in resettlement and cultural transmission. These archaeological findings continue to refine scholarly understanding of the Late Bronze Age collapse. They illustrate how migration, warfare, and environmental pressures contributed to the transformation of political, economic, and social systems across the Mediterranean. The combination of Egyptian textual evidence and material culture allows historians to trace both immediate disruptions and longer-term cultural processes, bridging the gap between contemporary records and modern interpretations. The rediscovery of these sites has also prompted methodological developments in archaeology. Stratigraphic analysis, radiocarbon dating, and comparative studies of ceramics and fortifications enable scholars to place events within precise chronological frameworks. This precision allows for correlations between different regions, revealing patterns of simultaneous disruption that support the existence of widespread systemic crises rather than isolated incidents. Through the continued study of Egyptian reliefs, Levantine settlements, and Aegean sites, modern archaeology has transformed the Sea Peoples from enigmatic invaders into a comprehensible historical phenomenon. The evidence demonstrates their role in shaping the transition from the Late Bronze Age to the Early Iron Age, highlighting both the destructive and integrative aspects of their movement. By combining multiple lines of evidence, researchers reconstruct the complex interactions between migrating populations, coastal cities, and imperial powers during a critical period of Mediterranean history. These discoveries also opened broader debates about the causes of the Late Bronze Age collapse, prompting historians to consider the interplay of warfare, migration, trade disruption, and environmental factors. Archaeology thus not only recovers the physical traces of the Sea Peoples, but also informs the interpretive frameworks through which scholars evaluate the transformations that reshaped the Mediterranean world. Before we continue the journey through history, make sure to hit the subscribe button, click the bell icon to receive every Nightfall history video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know which part of the Sea Peoples story fascinates you the most. Your engagement helps uncover the past with us, one chapter at a time.